This conference will now be recorded.
Hey guys, it's Rich Lehman. I'm the head coach of the Dalhousie cross country and track and field teams, as well as the Halifax Athletics Club, and I'm also the endurance expert with Athletics Nova Scotia. We figured that with everybody stuck inside right now and all PSO events on hold, we'd try to get some coach professional development going, and then obviously this would be available to athletes as well through Athletics Nova Scotia. And I'm not sure where John's gonna put it up, but I'm sure that will be circulated to the membership. My hope is to get something out once a week while we're in the state that we're in now. My hope is to do them every Tuesday afternoon and get them to John, and we'll see. Hope maybe they'll go up that night or maybe the next day. So that's the idea. If there are any questions that people want answered, if there's a certain presentation that you'd like to see or anything like that, you can either send me an email at richard.a.lehman, Lehman, @gmail.com, or you can send them to Jonathan Doucette, and he'll forward them along. So what we're looking at today is, we sort of thought this through basically yesterday that this is what I was going to try to do with some of my time here. So this is a presentation that I did at the Dalhousie coach camp that we hosted in the summer. So there's 5 or 6 of you that have already seen this. So but other than that, this is a new presentation. We haven't done a webinar with it or anything like that. And it's just a very general overview of sort of my process when I'm making a YTP, a yearly training program for either an individual athlete or for a team, which would be more in the cross country side of things. This is by no means me saying this is the only way to do it. It's just a step-by-step approach of how I go about things. This gets covered fairly in depth in the performance coach or competition develop or level 3 or whatever you want to call it. But I know that's that course is offered very seldomly, and when it is, coaches are they're expected to give up a full weekend and all that, so it can be tough. And then the YTP is covered in club coach, but we go over it so quickly that I think we actually leave more questions unanswered than questions that we answer. So hopefully this can at least get you started or give you an idea of some of the things that you might want to incorporate. But as I said, I want to be very clear. This is not the only way to do it. This is just the way I do it. So periodization, making a plan and deviating from it. What is periodization? Very, very generally, it's long-term cyclic structuring of training and practice to maximize performance to coincide with important competitions. It's the blueprint of your training plan, and it's always very high level. I'm going to keep harping on this when I say it's high level and it's the blueprint. What you don't want to see when you're looking at somebody's YTP is sort of that granular specific workouts. I'm not making a plan at the end of August for what I suspect an athlete is going to be ready to do in January as far as the actual session that they're doing. I don't believe that there's any way I could know what kind of session that athlete is going to be ready for. So when I'm talking about a yearly training plan, and I believe this aligns with what Athletics Canada and the NCCP is advocating as well, you're not writing workouts for the whole year. You're literally just laying out a blueprint that you will do your best to follow, but inevitably things are going to change, and ultimately that's our job as coaches is making that plan and then being malleable and ready to change when necessary. Some key terms before we dive right into it. Microcycle, literally just a collection of training stimuli. So that can be a session in the weight room. That can be for, all of this is, I guess I should go back. This is very endurance focused. There's probably going to be little tidbits that coaches from other event groups can sort of pick up here, but almost everything that I'm going to be talking about is going to be endurance specific. So yeah, it's a collection of training stimuli. Could be in the weight room, could be your easy run, could be an on-track session, could be a fartlek, could be a threshold, could be any kind of training stimulus. Microcycle is just a collection of those. It's always going to be the smallest cycle within your plan, and it usually includes a uniform number of sessions. So, for that's going to, every microcycle is generally going to have the same number of quality sessions, same number of strength sessions, same number of recovery sessions, that kind of thing. That that can change microcycle to microcycle, but usually you're going to have a framework of this is how many of each type of session we're getting in each microcycle. Usually in age class training, they're 7 days because that social construct of 1 week makes sense for training. If everything else that an athlete is doing is on a 7-day cycle and they're on a 10-day training cycle, it's pretty hard to plan the rest of their life around it. And very, very few of us, if any of us, are working with professional athletes who are able to revolve their entire life around their training schedule. So for most of us, we're not only looking at academic load and whether they have a full-time or part-time job, we're also looking at scheduling our training sessions in around training sessions for other sports and other extracurriculars that the athletes might have, especially if you're talking high school or younger, which again most of us are. Microcycles can be as long as the coach chooses. I've seen coaches working with adult marathoners who will have as much as a 21-day microcycle. I've gone up to 10. Actually, I've gone up to 14 with some of the longer and older athletes. But I always my microcycles are always separated by a rest day. And when I say a rest day, I mean off. You're not really doing anything. You might have some recovery stuff that you're doing, but they're not running and they're not lifting. Heart rate is staying down. Mesocycle is just a collection of microcycles. It's the next longest or the next shortest cycle in your plan. Usually for me, my mesocycles tend to be between 2 and 5 microcycles, and they're targeting one or a few desired athletic qualities. So when I'm going into a new meso with an athlete, whether I communicate this with them or not, generally what I'm looking at is these are the 1 to 3 things that we're really focusing on in this mesocycle. So you don't want to spread yourself too thin, but a mesocycle is definitely, in my opinion, too long to be really just zeroed in on one thing, unless that one thing is pure aerobic capacity. If you're just running, that can definitely be the entire focus of a mesocycle. Wouldn't recommend it often, but sometimes you need that. And for me, our mesocycles are typically separated by a rest or a deloaded microcycle. So they're not necessarily off. In fact, they're almost never off. The only time they would be off is if a mesocycle ends sort of going into Christmas or something like that, where we may give them 3 or 4 days off to just be with their family and not be thinking about track. But we're looking, we'll deload, bring everything down so that the athlete is able to recover before we load back up in the next mesocycle. Macrocycle is once again just the next step up. It's a collection of mesocycles. Uh, Generally speaking, at least for me, it always includes all phases of the yearly or seasonal plan. So once you're separated by downtime right there, once you're finished your that macro cycle, you're taking a couple weeks down, you're not running at all, we're trying to get emotionally, mentally, physically recharged to start our next big push. Where to start? This I think is the most daunting part for most people when they're doing yearly planning, especially if the reason that they're doing it is for an evaluation piece with the NCCP. I think that there's not really enough of us who are actually doing this as part of our coaching practice. We learn how to do it and what the value is, and then we decide we don't have time to do it. And I think the biggest reason for that is because actually sitting down and starting is probably the hardest part. So what I like to do is the first thing I'll do is I will just plot out key competition dates that fall within the macro cycle. Usually that's easy to do. You could argue that right now it's not, but usually you have your calendar in front of you, whether that's the NSSAF calendar, the Athletics Nova Scotia calendar, the Athletics Canada calendar, right on up to the Diamond League calendar. They're all available to you, and it should be pretty easy to work backwards from what the main goal for that macro cycle is, and just sort of plot out your competition dates. Very important to know the athlete's goals for these key competition dates, so it's not just we're going to go to the junior national championships at the end of June and run a race. You should have, before you're sitting down to make a plan, you should have an idea of what the athlete's goals are for those competitions. So before you're doing any planning, you're making sure that you and the athlete are aligned on what the goal and what the end result is that both of you would be happy with. As a coach, it is your job to have a clear understanding of what is required to achieve those goals. So sometimes that may, you may be faced with an athlete whose goals and their capacity to achieve those goals are maybe a little bit more advanced than anything that you've worked with before as a coach. And to me, that's not an excuse to not be equipped to at least help the athlete make that happen, or give them the best possibility or best chance of making that happen. So you have to know what is required to achieve those goals. For example, if somebody comes to you and says they want to, let's say we're talking about a U20 male 1500 meter runner, and they're saying they want to win a medal at junior nationals in the 1500. So, it's very easy to go back and look at the last 5 years and see what kind of time that takes. Generally speaking, you got to be able to run 348 to 352 to be in that conversation, which is great. But you got to be also aware of the fact that athlete said they want a medal. They didn't say they want to run 348 to 352. There are plenty of kids who have been able to just jump on a track and time trial that kind of time, who get into that competition environment and they're just not ready for it. So more importantly, you have to know what it took in those specific races. So if you know it's going to take about 350 to win or to medal, you also should know it takes 350 to medal in that race. You go back to Ottawa a couple years ago, it was 40 degrees and the first 800 meters was at 4-minute pace. So that's suddenly no longer 350 runners. Those are 345 runners running 350. So you have to know what is going to be required to achieve those goals, or you're going to be putting your athlete in a situation where they're not prepared on the most important day of their season. And it's our job to make sure that they are prepared. They've got to execute. You can't do that for them. But if we don't put them in a situation where we know at least where we know what is required, and that they are on any given day ready to do that, that's where we run into problems. So you got to be honest as well. A lot of times it's our job to maybe temper some of those expectations. If somebody comes to you and says, I want to win a medal at a junior national championship, and they've never run faster than 4:15 and they've never won in an SSAF championship, you're maybe having a conversation about setting some smarter goals before you're sitting down and writing your plan. Uh, you know, in order to do something like that, we know from experience that athlete needs to be not only dominating at the NSSAF level, they've probably got to be dominating events on either side. If it's a 1500, they should probably be winning the 800 and the 3K as well at the high school provincials. They should be breaking records. That's the kind of athlete that it takes to win medals at that level. Next thing you're doing after you've got your competitions in place and you've got a set of realistic expectations for the season between you and your athlete. Next thing that I'm doing is determining the length of my cycles. This will always depend on a few things. The age of the athlete, chronological age, biological age, and training age are all very important. Somebody brand new to the sport, no matter how talented they are or how good you think they could be down the road, you're probably not throwing a 10-day microcycle at them and saying, it's 10 days between your off days. That's a pretty good recipe for injury almost immediately. And the same thing on the other side, right? If you're working with a 30-year-old marathoner, you're not giving them cycle lengths that are more appropriate for an age class athlete. Distance of the goal race, again, when you're talking endurance, you're basically looking at the 800 all the way up to the marathon. So you're definitely not going to be structuring those plans the same. They're going to be completely different. There's almost nothing about them that are the same, except for the fact that aerobic ability is the most important part of both races. For the marathon, it's almost all of it, if not all of it. For the 800, it's greater than half, but that's probably it. And then it's got to be based on a schedule that the athlete can realistically keep. So you've got to know their work schedule, you got to know their academic schedule, you've got to know their schedule with other sports, and then you also have to know what their social and family life is like. Very hard if you're coaching an athlete who is working full time, has a family, and you're saying, well, okay, we're gonna run twice a day every day for 14 days in a row, and that's just how we're doing it. So you're gonna have to manage things based on the schedule the athlete can keep realistically. What I like to do is decide on the macro length first, whether that's a full season or if that's a full year or one season. A lot of times I'll do it by, the cross country season is one, and then the indoor outdoor season is another. Then I'll determine the microcycle length. As I said, for almost exclusively 7 days for me, with one or two a little bit longer. And then after that, the mesos will fall into place. Map out your cycles. This one seems pretty simple, but consult a calendar and get the dates right. And then create a framework that works for you. When we're done the presentation, I'm just going to quickly throw up the model that I use. But really the only thing that matters is that you can read it. So, like, yes, at the club coach level, there's sort of a framework that's given out that you can use, and that's great. But I've always found that, as the coach, you need to be the one who's comfortable with what you're working with. So if that means you sit down and you create it from scratch, that's great, because um, there's one or two athletes that I will share my plans with. Uh, that's about it. It's for you. This is a tool that you're building for yourself. So you make sure that you can read it and that you're able to follow it. And once you've done that framework, you'll be looking at a blank canvas, which with your determined cycle length. That's And then you just start filling things in. The next thing I do is I'll list the required athletic qualities. I won't prioritize them yet. I will literally just make a list of these are the tools that an athlete requires to achieve this goal. So they must align with what you decided was required to accomplish your final goal. Some will be global traits, others will be individualized. Again, talking about 1500, we know you're going to have good aerobic capacity to run a good 1500. Doesn't mean you don't have to train it. Doesn't make it unimportant. But that's the easy one. That's the global trait. That's every very good 1500-meter runner is also a good endurance runner. It just works that way. You see very few world-class 1500 runners that can't run good cross country. You see very few provincial level 1500 runners who can't run provincial level cross country. So that would be a global trait. Others will be individualized. What we do know about the 1500 is that that third lap is a killer, right? I'd say it's greater than 50% the number of times that when you're debriefing a 1500 with an athlete who had a not so great day, it almost always you're pointing at that third lap. For some, that might be a mental skills session, that kind of thing. For others, there are some. I've worked with one or two who don't fall apart in that third lap, so you're not necessarily putting that on on your list of required athletic qualities, because that athlete has that well enough to not have to put it in there. From there, I'm mapping out my mesocycles. We organize them based on which athletic qualities will be targeted, which is why right before that you're listing those. At this point is when you start having to really understand the athlete that you're working with and how they adapt to training stimuli. There's not a whole lot in the way of athletic qualities that are for every single human. It's going to work this fast in this way. So you got to get to know what works for each athlete. So you must understand how long adaptation takes following each stimulus. And again, that's for the individual athlete. If I know that we're working with a 1500 runner who, going into this next mesocycle, the main focus is going to be our ability to shift gears. Pace change is probably more important in the 1500 than it is in any other endurance event, because the race can go in so many different ways. So if you know that you're going to have a few sessions within that mesocycle where changing pace without tightening up is the main focus, you need to understand how many times you need to sort of press that button before it's ingrained in that athlete. Then you need to think about how long each quality takes to detrain. Right, so you're not putting something like max speed so early in your plan that by the time your racing season comes, they've lost that speed. You don't necessarily have to train it constantly once you've built it, but then you also have to know how long an activity must be engaged in to maintain proficiency. very, very generally speaking, the model that I like to use is if we are obviously if we're not doing anything, if we go a whole microcycle, if we're going microcycles without doing something, we're going to detrain that ability. Uh, if we're only doing that thing once in a microcycle, we're probably still detraining it, but at a slower rate. Uh, Twice in a microcycle is where I start to say, okay, we have the ability to maintain. So a lot of our weight sessions we'll only be doing twice a week. Um, we're unless if we're not trying to get stronger. If we're not trying to get our top speed up, but we don't want it to go down, we'll sprint twice a week. And then 3 or more is how many times a week I like to put something into a microcycle if what we're trying to do is build it. That's not going to work for everybody in every situation, but that's sort of that's the base that I start at. Next, I'll map out my microcycles. Just to reiterate, this is still not the time to script specific workouts. What I'm doing within a microcycle when I'm planning it is I'm selecting energy systems or athletic qualities that will be targeted in each individual session. So we were doing that with mesocycles before. Now we're doing it at a more granular level with microcycles, where it's not over these next 5 weeks we are going to look to develop this quality. It's okay, on Tuesday we are going to do this session, which should help us on the road to developing this quality. So it's the same general idea, except much more granular, and we're looking at individual days at this point. This is, it's on this slide, but it could be literally anywhere in this presentation. The thing to remember always is that stress plus rest equals growth. That's our equation at all times when we're coaching. If we are not applying enough stress, if the stimulus is too low, basically if the training load is too low or the training frequency is too low, we're not going to see any growth. We're not going to see any improvement. Equal to that is rest, in that if our training frequency is high and our training load is high, but our ability to recover is low, we're also not going to see it. So we need both, and you're going to be manipulating that on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily just a cycle-to-cycle basis. Like literally every day, you are that's the only equation you have in your head, right? Stress plus rest equals growth. Without one, nothing happens. You need both. So now what? Now that you've got your plan, you start coaching. Writing a plan is great, but it is, I would say, it's less than 10% of what we actually do. You know, I've seen some great plans. I've written some what I thought were great plans that we threw out the window about a week later. All good plans are malleable. There's no way to guarantee that the athlete will be exactly where you plan. So panicking is not helping anybody. Day-to-day coaching means deviating from your plan, and specific workouts are going to be scripted in the trenches, right? So depending on the time of year, in the fall, I tend to, where I'm planning for a whole team in cross country, I will write those workouts on the Monday of the week that we're in and send them out. In the track season, especially the outdoor track season, I won't actually script a workout until I've seen the athletes warming up. It's a lot easier to do on an outdoor track in the middle of summer than it is at the Dowplex, where you can only see them from the waist up. But those specific workouts, if you've got your plan in front of you and you're comfortable with it, they don't matter that much, other than the fact that you could overload or underload an athlete based on where they actually are. So if I knew, if it's a Saturday morning at the Dowplex in the middle of January, and I know that what I had planned for that day was like a good lactic session at 800 effort, whether I do 2 sets of 5 300, 2 sets of 400, 200, 200, 6 by 300, that kind of workout, doesn't actually matter, except for the fact that like the better the better recovered the athlete looks and feels, and how they're reporting and how they're moving, uh, the harder the session you can give them and get that same benefit. Uh, but harder doesn't always mean better. So you're writing those workouts. I would recommend writing those workouts as late as possible, given like as long as you have a plan of what energy systems you're supposed to be hitting on various days. And then this is the final slide here. What separates endurance from the other event groups? Uh, because as I led with this. This is meant to be an endurance specific approach. Endurance is actually of the four event groups. It's really the only event that you can't train by simply performing the event. And that's not. I'm not trying to downplay the other events or make it seem like it's harder to coach endurance, because it's not. I would actually argue that it's easier to coach endurance than it is to coach any other event. But when you're at a track and field practice with a full track and field team and you're looking around the track, uh, you know the throwers are throwing, the jumpers are jumping. They're just doing their event. They're getting technical feedback as they go. The number of throws and the number of jumps are different. In the jumps, the number of steps that they're taking in their approach is going to be different. Um, the sprinters they're not just running 60 meters every time, but the sprinters are sprinting. Uh, and they are training the one energy system that is at play in their event. We, with possibly the exception of the marathon, uh, every time we go out and compete, every time we go out and train, we're running through multiple energy systems. So every microcycle has to have multiple energy systems at play, and I would argue that every session should have at least two. Uh, you're actually going to detrain if you're training for a 1500 by just running 1500s, or by just running at 1500 pace anytime you run. You're going to get injured, or you're actually going to get slower. So you're looking at it's a much bigger range of types of things that you have to do, and it's a lot harder in our event to come out of a training session with an idea of how fast an athlete is ready to run. Because there's just so much at play when we compete as well. We don't have our own lane. Where the jumpers and throwers when they're up, they're the only ones there. There's not just suddenly someone in their way, that kind of thing, right? So you've endurance, I believe, is the most volatile of the event groups as far as the unknowns and some of the things that we have to deal with in competition. So we have to plan for all of those things. So we can't just go and train physically. We have to go and make sure that we are preparing for everything that could happen on competition days. And you can't just do the event to train for it. And then that last piece is important. Most athletic qualities can be trained in multiple ways. Uh, it's endurance is specific to a point, but you can get the heart rate up in the pool. You can get the heart rate up on a bike. Uh, I've heard arguments that you can actually train for endurance in the weight room. Strength wise, you don't necessarily like. Now is a good time to be talking about this. None of us have access to a weight room right now. You know, plyos, hills, like all kinds of things can sort of step in and take the place of another thing. So use your imagination, be creative. Almost everything that we do can be trained in multiple ways. So again, as I mentioned, we're just going to quickly look at the model that I use. All I do here is I color code the months literally just for simplicity for myself. Put the weeks in here. I go Saturday to Saturday because generally speaking, Saturdays are our most intense session all year. And generally speaking, our races are on Saturdays as well. Then I'm plugging in the competition. So there's 1500 here. This was Michaela Walker's 2016 season. Competitions go up here, and then I'm putting the it's a bit bigger, the running training focus priority, and I prioritize it as 1 to 5. And there's a bit of a legend at the bottom that we'll go through. But for Michaela, it was running volume. For every athlete that I work with, running volume is going to be here. I use minutes per week instead of kilometers or miles. I think basically anybody who's ever heard me give a presentation or who's worked with me knows why I do that. But the main reason for that is if you're planning your week based on, okay, I need to hit 150 kilometers this week, and the athlete is, they're sore, they're tired, they're fatigued, they're sick, they maybe had 4 exams that week, whatever the case is, if their session the next day is scripted as a 20-kilometer run and they're just feeling like garbage and they go out and they just slog out 20K, they're actually probably on their feet for 15, 20 minutes longer than they would have been if they felt good, or maybe 10, 15 minutes longer than they would have been if they felt good. So you're literally you're taking an athlete who is already fatigued, and you're actually getting them to spend more time on their feet the next day because they're running slower. So I like to do everything in minutes, so that the way the athlete feels that day can dictate a little bit, at least, of what we're doing. Running intensity, VO2, which is just your 3K, 5K pace work. Lactic threshold, which I value quite highly for most athletes, but you can take it or leave it. Overspeed, I define it in this case as percent of time spent at 800 pace or faster. This was for a 1500 meter runner, with who her 800, the 800 was her secondary event. So I call anything that is faster than an event that she will race is overspeed. So that could actually be 10K pace for a marathoner, but that's just the way I've defined it on this particular plan. And then change of pace within runs and within repetitions. Then down here we've got supplemental training. This, all of the running training focus, other than running volume and running intensity, everything else that I fill in is athlete dependent on what I believe that they need in order to achieve their goals. And the same with the supplemental training. Strength and power, usually we're doing this in the weight room. Mental toughness, for this athlete, you can actually see we're periodizing that a little bit as we get a little bit closer to key competitions. It's going up. That's going to be not only mental skills training, which we'll do, but that'll also be included in the physical work that we're doing. If I know that an athlete struggles under pressure, I will make sure that on certain days we're applying way more pressure than we're applying on race days. We'll say something like, if you can't hit this time, then the other athletes, your teammates, are going to have to do extra stuff, or that kind of thing, to just put a little bit of pressure, get them in their own heads a little bit, and watch them sort of work through that, so that it's not a brand new experience on competition day. And then acute recovery, I do have this on all of them. What I mean by acute recovery is recovery pieces that aren't nutrition and sleep, or easy runs. So those recovery pieces are literally every single day of your athletic career. Those are key pieces. When I talk about acute recovery, I'm talking ice bath, I'm talking foam rolling, and in some cases we might be talking about an anti-inflammatory or something like that. The reason I put this into the training into a YTP, and the reason I periodize it, is because in some cases you want that inflammation. You want the athlete's body to figure out naturally how to recover and adapt. Back to that stress plus rest equals growth. if you're not letting your body naturally grow and naturally improve, then that improvement's not actually going to be the way you want it to be. The same kind of thing is, when if you've ever had a cold and you're just pumping yourself full of cold medication, and that cold maybe lasts a little bit longer, inflammation can be a good thing, and if we are artificially manipulating it every time we train, I believe our bodies are going to lose the ability to actually to adapt on their own. So we will, we'll load up on that kind of stuff here. I mean, you can see for Michaela here, we were up to threes this, on the weekend of February 27th. So that would have been the AUS championships. The weekend after that, and then the weekend of March 12th, which would have been the U Sports or CIS championships at that time. So we're doing that kind of thing when we need to be at our best, but we're not doing much of it in here through December, January, where the bulk of the hard training is happening. Like if you look up here in the running training section, these are high numbers, but we're not doing much in the way of acute recovery here, because the idea was we wanted her body to adapt on its own. So that's the model that I use. Everybody, I believe, I encourage everybody to go out and come up with something that you're comfortable with. But if you are watching this and you want sort of a blank version of this, I'm happy to send it. I'm happy to deal with any questions that anybody might have. As I said, reach out via email or reach out through Jonathan. And my hope is to have something up every week. So hopefully this is beneficial to somebody out there.